Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty unique today. The very first chapter of Matthew's Gospel.
The genealogy.
Yeah, a genealogy. On the surface, it might seem kind of like a snooze fest, right? Just a long list of names.
Well, trust me, it's anything but boring.
Okay, you've got to sell me on this one.
It's actually a brilliant piece of writing. Matthew's laying out Jesus' family tree like a legal document, carefully connecting him to key figures in Jewish history.
So it's more than just, hey, here's who begat who. There's like a purpose behind it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Matthew's making a case. He's establishing Jesus' credentials, so to speak.
Our source, MCS Matthew, the Jewish Messiah, highlights how Matthew starts with Messiah and then links Jesus back to figures like Abraham and King David. Why that order?
Because it ties into two major promises from God. The Abrahamic and Davidic covenants.
Oh, right. Those covenants are huge in Jewish thought, right?
Hugely important. The Davidic covenant promised an everlasting throne through David's descendants. So Jesus' lineage here is crucial.
Okay, so Matthew's saying, look, Jesus is the rightful heir. And what about the Abrahamic covenant?
That one promised blessings for all nations through Abraham's offspring. By highlighting both covenants up front, Matthew's making a bold claim. Jesus fulfills them both.
Which might have surprised some people back then, right? Like they might have expected two separate messiahs.
You got it. And he keeps building on this. Remember Jacob and Esau? Matthew emphasizes that Jesus descends from Jacob, not the firstborn son, Esau.
Which, if I remember correctly, goes back to God choosing Jacob over Esau, like the younger brother would lead.
Right. It reinforces the idea that God's hand is at work in this lineage. It's not just about straightforward inheritance. Then, things get even more interesting when you look at the women included in Jesus' genealogy.
Oh, yeah. There are 4 Gentile women in there, right?
Yep. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Each with a fascinating story. And none of them would have been considered traditionally part of the chosen line.
So, what's the significance of including them? It seems kind of radical for Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience.
It is radical. It hints at the inclusive nature of God's plan. It's like Matthew's throwing open the door saying, everyone has a place at the table.
Wow. So this genealogy isn't just a list of names, it's a statement.
Exactly. And that statement continues to unfold as we trace the genealogy through the rise and fall of the Israelite kingdom. We see key moments, like a history lesson leading up to Jesus.
Like a build-up, a crescendo.
Yes. And then there's this seemingly devastating prophecy about Jehoiachin.
Who was? Remind me.
He was a king, a descendant of David. But there was this prophecy that none of his descendants could claim David's throne.
Oh, wow. Talk about a dead end. So how does that work with Jesus being the Messiah if he's descended from this guy?
That's the point. Matthew sets up this seemingly impossible situation, which makes the arrival of Jesus, who descended from Jehoiachin, even more significant. And to emphasize this, he structures the genealogy into 3 sets of 14 generations.
Okay, why 14? Does that number have some kind of meaning?
Absolutely. The numerical value of King David's name in Hebrew is 14. It reinforces the Davidic lineage and God's hand in this whole genealogy.
Wow, Matthew's thinking about every detail. So we've got Jesus's lineage meticulously laid out, and then bam, the virgin birth. Talk about a plot twist.
It is. It's where the story shifts from earthly lineage to divine intervention. Matthew carefully explains the Jewish custom of being pledged to be married. So Joseph and Mary were legally bound, but not yet living together.
And Joseph, good guy that he was, decides to break things off quietly to protect Mary. But then that angel appears to him in a dream, right?
Right. And that message is amazing. The angel calls Joseph son of David, reminding him of his own lineage.
Wow. So it all ties back together.
It does. And then the angel explains how the child was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and that the child will be named Yeshua, meaning Adonai saves.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Divine confirmation on top of everything else.
Right. And Matthew doesn't stop there. He immediately connects this miraculous birth to Isaiah's prophecy, a virgin conceiving and bearing a son named Emmanuel.
God with us. Wow.
That prophecy, by the way, was originally given during a time of great uncertainty for the Jewish people.
So now, centuries later, it finds its fulfillment in the birth of Jesus.
Exactly. The virgin birth, though, it plays a crucial role in solidifying Jesus' claim as the heir to both covenants. In Jewish tradition, the first son received a double inheritance.
Hold on. What do you mean first son? In what sense?
A son born without a father. Jesus, conceived by the Holy Spirit, is considered the first son in this way. It emphasizes his unique position and inheritance.
Wow, that's incredible. I never connected those dots. So Matthew is using familiar Jewish concepts to explain this radical event.
He's a master storyteller. He takes something familiar and weaves it into this extraordinary narrative.
So we've got the genealogy, the virgin birth, the fulfillment of prophecy. It's clear that Matthew is going all in to present Jesus as the Jewish Messiah.
Absolutely. He's meticulously crafting a narrative to resonate with his intended audience. It's not just stating facts, it's weaving together all these elements to create a compelling argument.
He's not just telling a story, he's building a case.
Yes. And it's intellectually stimulating, but also emotionally engaging. He wants his readers to both understand and feel the weight of what he's saying.
I'm already seeing the first chapter of Matthew in a whole new light. I can't wait to see what other insights we uncover as we keep going.
It's important to remember the context, right? This idea of a virgin birth. Even within Jewish messianic expectations, it would have been radical.
Yeah, like how would people have reacted to this claim back then?
Oh, it would have been mind-blowing. And I think Matthew anticipated some pushback. That's why he's so careful to ground Jesus' birth in prophecy and the historical context.
He's not just presenting it as a fantasy tale. It's like he's saying, look, this might seem unbelievable, but here's the evidence.
Exactly. He's directly confronting the theological implications, weaving together all these layers of meaning. Like, he explicitly states that Joseph didn't have sexual relations with Mary until after Jesus was born.
Oh, yeah, that's a detail I hadn't really thought about. It really reinforces the miraculous nature of the conception. And it speaks to Joseph's character, too, his obedience and willingness to trust God in the face of something so extraordinary.
Right. And remember, Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience. He would have known that the concept of a firstborn son was huge, culturally and legally.
Right. You mentioned earlier that the firstborn son was entitled to a double inheritance. How does that tie into the virgin birth?
It elevates Jesus' status even further. See, by being born of a virgin, Jesus is considered the first son in a unique way. He inherits not only from Joseph, his legal father, but also gains a spiritual inheritance as the Son of God.
So he's inheriting from both sides, the earthly and the divine.
Exactly. It reinforces his claim as the rightful heir to both the Davidic and Abrahamic covenants.
Wow, Matthew is so clever in the way he uses these familiar Jewish concepts to underscore the significance of Jesus' birth.
He's a master storyteller. He takes something familiar and weaves it into this extraordinary narrative.
So we've covered the genealogy, the virgin birth, the fulfillment of prophecy. What else stands out to you from this opening chapter? What's the key message that ties all of this together?
I think it boils down to Matthew's overarching goal to present Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of God's promises to his people.
That makes sense. Everything we've discussed so far points to that.
Right. And Matthew accomplishes this by meticulously crafting a narrative that resonates with his audience.
Yeah.
He doesn't just state facts. He weaves together genealogy, historical context, cultural nuances, prophecy. It creates this really compelling argument for Jesus' identity.
It's like he's building a case, piece by piece.
Yes. And he's doing it in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and emotionally engaging. He wants his readers to not only understand who Jesus is, but to also grasp the profound implications of his birth and lineage.
This deep dive has definitely made me appreciate the depth and complexity of Matthew's gospel. It's so much more than just a straightforward account of Jesus' life.
Oh, absolutely. And we've only just scratched the surface. There are so many more layers of meaning waiting to be explored, so many more connections to be made.
I can't wait to dive deeper. But before we move on to the rest of Matthew's gospel, what's something our listeners should keep in mind as they continue reading? What's a key insight?
That's a great question. I would say this. Pay close attention to how Matthew connects Jesus' life and teachings back to the Hebrew Scriptures.
Like, he's constantly drawing parallels, showing how Jesus fulfills prophecies and embodies the spirit of the law.
Exactly. This connection is crucial for understanding Matthew's argument and the reader appreciating the continuity between the Old and New Testaments.
It's like Matthew is constantly saying, look, this isn't something new. This has been God's plan all along, woven into the very fabric of our history and scriptures.
Yes. And by recognizing those connections, readers can gain a much deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of Jesus' mission and message.
So it's an invitation to see the whole biblical narrative in a new light.
It is. Okay, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's wrap up our discussion of the virgin birth. What's the most important takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
But what's the one thing they should walk away with?
This. The virgin birth is not just about a miraculous conception. It's about the incarnation, the incredible reality that God himself entered human history in the person of Jesus Christ. This sets the stage for everything that follows in the Christian story.
It really does reframe the entire narrative when you think about it that way.
It does. And it makes you appreciate how Matthew presents this crucial part of Jesus' story. He wants us to understand not just the facts, but also the deeper theological implications.
Well said. Now let's shift gears and explore the other parts of Matthew's gospel. I'm excited to see how he continues to develop these themes. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From Jesus' genealogy to the virgin birth. It's obvious that Matthew is very intentional with his writing. He's really trying to connect with his Jewish audience.
He is. He's not just telling a story, He's building a bridge between the Hebrew scriptures and the life of Jesus.
It's like he's showing how Jesus is both rooted in Jewish tradition and the fulfillment of its deepest hopes.
Right. It's not a departure from their faith. It's the culmination of it.
I like that. The culmination.
One way he does this is through those constant connections back to the Hebrew scriptures.
Oh, yeah. He's always saying that it might be fulfilled, or as it is written.
Exactly. It's like he's highlighting this thread that runs through the entire biblical narrative, connecting prophecy and fulfillment.
And it's brilliant because it invites his Jewish audience to see Jesus not as some outsider, but as the embodiment of God's promises to their ancestors.
Absolutely. Instead of presenting Jesus as someone who overturns the law and the prophets, Matthew shows him as the one who fulfills them.
It's a much more persuasive approach for sure, especially given the cultural and religious context.
It is. And it transforms reading Matthew's gospel into this dynamic conversation across centuries.
Yeah.
We're invited to engage with the text, wrestle with its implications.
It's not just passively absorbing information. It's like actively participating in a dialogue that's been going on for millennia.
And that dialogue continues to challenge and inspire us today as we grapple with the significance of Jesus' life, teachings, and his sacrifice.
Speaking of sacrifice, it just hit me how the themes of the virgin birth that we discussed earlier, they seem to foreshadow Jesus' ultimate purpose, this idea of God becoming flesh dwelling among us. It points to something even greater.
You're right. The virgin birth isn't just a standalone miracle. It's the foundation for the whole Christian story of redemption.
It sets the stage for Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, his offering himself as atonement for sins.
It's like a seed planted in the first chapter that blooms in the events of Jesus' passion.
I love that imagery.
Matthew carefully lays the groundwork for this understanding throughout his gospel. He connects Jesus' actions and teachings back to those themes of sacrifice and redemption woven throughout the Hebrew scriptures.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. It's amazing how much meaning is packed into every detail of Matthew's gospel.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover.
So much more.
But I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is this. Matthew's gospel is a carefully crafted narrative. It invites us to encounter Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of God's promises.
The bridge between heaven and earth.
Beautifully said.
And remember, everyone, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring Matthew's gospel. Allow yourselves to be challenged, transformed, and drawn deeper into the Christian story.
Yes. May your journey through Matthew's gospel be filled with insights and a renewed appreciation for the power of Jesus' message for our lives today.